It's a job that relies on witnesses. But the only ones you can really trust are the silent ones. Because the dead never lie. Silent Witness, a brand new series, starts next Saturday at 9:05 on BBC One.
Fine.
If your kids go away to college and they watch their own TV, they need to have a TV licence.
Fine.
If they're caught without one, they could face a fine of up to £1,000.
Fine.
And guess who'll end up paying for it?
I thought I might pop out for a bit. Could I borrow the car? I'll just jump on the bus then.
Fine.
For more information, call 0800 328 2020.
A week today I'll be going into hospital, and then a week tomorrow I'll be having a kidney transplant.
Going to be free. We're going to be free. It really does feel like that.
That's the bit I really want to happen.
A new life for Delise, the touching story of a mum's sacrifice to save her daughter. From everyday life comes one life. This Wednesday at 10:35 on BBC One.
The news now on BBC One with Matthew Amroli-Waller.
Emergency session at the UN after an Israeli air raid in Syria. Israel says they targeted militants. Syria calls it serious escalation. The Tories prepare for their conference with a promise to help pensioners. Hey Crespo, Chelsea bounce back with a win in the Premiership. And in Panorama, the Red Cross accuses America of creating a legal black hole at Guantanamo Bay. Vivian White hears allegations of torture and asks, how should America guard against the terrorist threat? Good evening. The UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan has strongly condemned Israel for carrying out a missile attack on Syrian territory. The UN Security Council is meeting now to consider its response. Israel insists it was targeting a training camp for Palestinian militants, but the Syrians say Israeli jets struck a civilian target just north of Damascus and call the raid a serious escalation. From Jerusalem, here's Jeremy Cook.
Israel has moved this conflict into a new arena, and here's why. The Israeli army is distributing this footage of a massive arms cache, enough weapons and ammunition for a small army. They say what we're looking at is part of a Palestinian training camp deep inside Syria, the target of last night's air raid. It's the first time in more than 20 years that the Israelis have hit Syria. Damascus has called it a grave escalation in tensions. The Israelis, though, are unrepentant.
Today's attack was to serve a very clear signal, both to the terrorist organization as well as to Syria, that this axis of terror will not be tolerated and the terrorists will not find any sanctuary.
The airstrike on Syria was a direct response to yesterday's suicide bomb in Haifa, a bloody attack on the eve of the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. Today, preparing for Yom Kippur, the people of Haifa have been remembering their dead, 20 victims in a city known as a model of coexistence. Amid it all, Yasser Arafat is a man showing the strain. Tonight he's declared a state of emergency across the Palestinian territories and installed a crisis cabinet. A move seemingly designed to show the world that he's ready to take action against the extremists after the Haifa bomb. For the Israelis, though, it's all irrelevant until they see results on the ground. The face of the suicide bomber who may have changed the course of this conflict. Hanadi Jaradat, the 29-year-old lawyer who killed innocent men, women and children. The Israelis say they will wage war against the people who sent her, wherever they are. Jeremy Cook, BBC News, Jerusalem.
The air raid was the first Israeli military operation on such a large scale and so deep into Syria in more than 25 years and has provoked international condemnation. Our diplomatic correspondent, Mike Wooldridge, reports now on what effect today's action could have on the search for peace in the Middle East.
Syria's response to the raid, confined for now at least to the UN, but it says it wants the international community to show it will not tolerate such actions by Israel.
Syria will raise its concerns and its position on this brutal attack, unjustifiable attack.
But it's the American response that will be key, and so far the US has refrained from direct criticism of the Israeli raid. The diplomatic reverberations were felt first in the Middle East, as Egypt's President Hosni Mubarak met the visiting German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder. The Egyptian leader called the Israeli strike aggression against a brotherly state. Chancellor Schröder said it was unacceptable, and so too did France. Israel has crossed a new line today in striking into Syria in this way. Its claim is that an axis of terror directed against Israel runs from Iran to Syria and on to the occupied territories. It says it's sending a signal to Syria to stop supporting terrorist activity, something Syria denies doing. It's also warning that this may not be the last operation of its kind. Tony Blair meeting Syria's President Assad, Britain calculating that it's better to engage critically with Syria than keep it out in the cold. That way, the better the chances of peace across the Middle East, including in Iraq. Britain today urged restraint on all sides, but it will take more than that to keep the hopes for peace alive. Mike Aldridge, BBC News.
Well, live now to Jerusalem and our Middle East correspondent Jeremy Cook. Jeremy, what's your analysis of the state of emergency that Yasser Arafat has declared tonight?
Well, I think Yasser Arafat seems to be signalling to the outside world that he is finally ready to launch some sort of crackdown on the likes of Hamas and Islamic Jihad. At the same time, though, I would say that the Israelis will be deeply cynical and sceptical about this state of emergency. They say Yasser Arafat is a man who for 3 years has failed to deliver on this crackdown. And tonight, of course, he is a man under great pressure and someone who the Israelis say that they are ready to expel from the Holy Land. Now, put all this together, and I think the Israelis will be saying that they will only take any notice of this state of emergency at all, and it will only change what they're doing in any way at all if they see real action on the ground. And no sign tonight, of course, that that is imminent.
Jeremy, thanks very much. Downing Street has dismissed as absurd claims that Tony Blair no longer believed Iraq had any usable weapons of mass destruction by the time he sent British troops into battle. The allegation is contained in a book by the former Cabinet Minister Robin Cook, who resigned from the government over the Iraq conflict.
In Iraq, the search continues for weapons of mass destruction. But according to Robin Cook, the Prime Minister did not believe those weapons threatened Britain even before he took the country to war. In the extracts from his book, Mr. Cook says Tony Blair was originally convinced of a threat. I have no reason to doubt that Tony Blair believed in September that Saddam really had weapons of mass destruction ready for firing in 45 minutes. But just before the war began, Mr. Cook discussed with the Prime Minister an intelligence briefing which suggested there were no weapons capable of being deployed beyond the battlefield. Mr. Blair didn't argue. Mr. Cook writes, what was clear from this conversation was that he did not believe it himself in March. Opposition politicians say the newspaper revelations add to the difficulties ahead for the Prime Minister.
When you take these allegations, along with the failure of the Iraqi survey group to find any weapons, as reported last week, and the likely conclusions of Lord Hutton's report, it all makes for a very torrid autumn for the Prime Minister.
But the man leading the search in Iraq says it's too soon to conclude there were no weapons.
If there's even the remotest possibility that those weapons still exist, we have an obligation to the American troops who are still there, to the Iraqi people whose security we're responsible to, and to everyone in the world to find out where those weapons are right now.
That view is shared inside Number 10. A spokesman described Robin Cook's claim as absurd. He said the Prime Minister had consistently held to his belief that weapons did exist, but finding them would considerably ease the pressure on Mr. Blair. Sean Lay, BBC News, Downing Street.
The Conservatives have promised a big increase in pensions if they win the next general election. On the eve of the party conference in Blackpool, the Conservative leader Ian Duncan Smith said the policy would make all pensioners £7 a week better off. John Pienaar has this report.
Pensioners are feeling hard done by. The right message might go down well. En route to Blackpool, Ian Duncan Smith has a big promise. Bigger pensions, tied to earnings, not just inflation, granting the request Labour's been turning down.
My father said to me, your main concern at the end of the day
is to make sure that those who have given to Britain, both in war and in peace, deserve respect. This Conservative government, when we get elected, will put pensioners right at the top of the list.
Under the Tory pension plan, there'd be £7 extra for single pensioners and £11 extra for couples. The Tories say that would cost £5 to £7 billion, but insists taxpayers would still be £720 million better off by year 4 through benefit changes and employment measures. The new policies amount to a hard sell with a distinctive style and designed for mass appeal, like the conference set shown off by the party chairman, Theresa May. Not every promise bears detailed scrutiny, like tax cuts, but they're confident they'll work out on the day.
We will get government off people's backs, and we will reduce the scale of government so that people run their lives, not me. There's the difference, and there's the choice.
He's arrived in Blackpool. Worrying headlines were there ahead of him. Allegations circulating about his office, where his wife Betsy was employed for some months after he became leader. He's tried to stamp on the story.
I say categorically to you now, if anybody makes such allegations, and if anybody does, I will sue them.
So it's not all sweetness and light by the seaside. Mr. Duncan Smith's team is saying his enemies are spreading false rumours about him. But there are many more doubters in the country who refuse to see him as a potential Prime Minister. This conference will be about trying to bridge that credibility gap. John Pienaar, BBC News, Blackpool.
Let's speak to our political editor, Andrew Marr, who's in Blackpool. Andrew, a promise on pensions, talk of tax cuts. How do they get it to add up?
Well, the first thing to say is that on pensions, this is by far the most important policy the Conservatives have unveiled in detail since Ian Duncan Smith became leader. And the thinking behind it is that we are facing a catastrophic collapse in savings in this country, and the first thing you have to do to deal with it is to restore a better, more generous state pension. Now, to pay for that, there are all sorts of measures they propose, but perhaps the most dramatic is axing entirely the New Deal for the long-term unemployed youth and single mothers, which the Tories say simply isn't working. Therefore, they think this will fund itself in effect, and they will still have room for tax cuts by getting rid of Whitehall bureaucracy and taking more power away from the centre and down to the local level, whether it's power over police or hospitals or indeed schools.
Now, personally, what does Ian Duncan Smith have to do at this conference this week, do you think?
Well, you know, there are two things I think that matter when you're a leader. One is belief in you, and there's not a lot he can do about that. This is the conference. He says it'll be the most important conference since 1986, where he finally puts forward the policies the Tories will be fighting the election on. But the other thing is self-belief, and I have to say I've just been talking to him, and either he's had something very strange in his coffee, or he is brimming with self-belief. He is in a dancing mood, and he has to convince this party that he really is their man, and there is no alternative.
Andrew Marr there in Blackpool, thanks very much. Now, despite his failing health, Pope John Paul II has created 3 new saints. The Pope, who's 83, looked frail but still managed to preside over the service in the Vatican St. Peter's Square, which lasted more than 2 hours. In Chechnya, the polls have closed in the election to choose a new president. The result is expected tomorrow. The region has been torn apart by the fighting since it tried to break away from Russia in 1994. Around 200,000 people have died. From Chechnya, Steve Rosenberg has this report.
In Chechnya today, they were putting on a show for the presidential election. But look at the audience. Tens of thousands of Russian troops are still in Chechnya. It's an election in a war zone. The show continued inside the polling stations. There were 7 candidates on the ballot, but only one of them had been given any real chance of winning. And that's Ahmad Kadyrov. The man who once called for a holy war against Russia is now Moscow's best friend, and the Kremlin's been working hard to get him elected. Before the vote, Mr. Kadyrov's 3 main rivals were struck from the ballot. Human rights groups denounced the election as a farce.
This is the image that Russia wants the rest of the world to see, a democratic election taking place in Chechnya. Truth is, many people here believe that this vote is neither free nor fair, and that the Kremlin has already made sure that its man is going to win.
But that's unlikely to end the war. Chechen rebels see Ahmad Kadyrov as a traitor. They've denounced the elections and vowed to fight on for independence from Russia. And without peace, Chechnya will remain a land in ruins, a memorial to the thousands who lost their lives in 2 wars. Even with the support of the Kremlin, changing that will be an almost impossible task. Steve Rosenberg, BBC News, Grozny.
Now, with news of a lively day in the Premiership and the rest of the day's sport, here's Mary Rose. Mary.
Thanks very much, Matthew. Well, Hernan Crespo's late goal maintained Chelsea's unbeaten Premiership season. They beat Middlesbrough 2-1 at the Riverside, while at Villa Park, all the action was packed into the second half of Aston Villa's 1-1 draw with Bolton.
Hernan Crespo began today on Millionaires Row, otherwise known as Chelsea's bench, whilst a man almost forgotten gave his side the lead. Eidur Gudjohnsen may not start many games this season, but he can certainly still finish. Middlesbrough were far from overawed though, and with the magnificent Mendieta supplying the subtle pass, Nemeth hammered in an equaliser and just 19 seconds into the second half.